Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's planning public meeting. I'm going to call it to order now at 5 o'clock and begin by inviting Councillor Forder to read our land acknowledgement.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We would like to begin by acknowledging that we are meeting on the traditional lands and treaty territory of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, which includes the Chippewas of Nawash Unceded First Nation and the Chippewas of Saugeen First Nation. We also recognize the Métis whose ancestors shared this land and these waters. We extend our gratitude to all Anishinaabe and Métis people and their descendants, past, present, and future, who continue to care for and inhabit these lands and tend these waters.
Now I'll just ask you to join me for a moment of silent reflection on today's business. Thank you. Is there any disclosure of pecuniary interest? Seeing none, I just remind you that if it occurs to you, you can bring it forward at that time. So we're gathered here today to learn more about a proposal to amend the land use planning permissions applying to certain lands in the municipality of Meaford. It's very important to note that the Planning Act requires that a person who may later wish to file an appeal to Council's decision on any of these matters must either provide verbal comments today at this public meeting or provide written comments to Council before the amendments are passed. The intention of this requirement is that only those people who have taken the time and the care to learn about the proposal and to engage in the planning process may have an opportunity to appeal a decision to the Ontario Land Tribunal. While Council is legally required to make decisions that conform to the county and local official plans, our guiding policies encourage us to reach out to you, members of the community, to hear your thoughts about the proposed changes. And we have a variety of legal tools available to us that we can apply to development that help us ensure that new uses can coexist with existing uses with as minimal an impact as possible. Your constructive comments will help us to learn more about your neighborhood, which in turn will help staff and council to select the right tools to manage change effectively and in a manner that honors our community values and priorities. Those who have pre-registered for today's meetings will have an opportunity to speak remotely or in person. You do not have to be solely in support or opposition. It's okay to share your thoughts about those elements that you do and do not like about the proposal and to ask questions as well. While the applicant will have an opportunity to respond to questions and comments at the end of the meeting, in some cases, we may need to have staff carry out research on the matters raised and provide answers or additional information to you following the meeting. And I'm going to call the meeting to order. This is a public meeting to consider a zoning bylaw amendment for lands known as Town of Meaford Plan 309, part of lots 1659 and 1660 in Meaford. This meeting is a mandatory part of the planning process, which has been set out by the Planning Act. Based on the rules in the Act, there must be at least 20 days notice given to residents within 120 meters of the property. Notice of the zoning bylaw amendment was issued on November 13, 2023, giving more than the required 20 days notice. So I'm going to start by asking Meredith Gillespie, planner, to give us a brief presentation about this application and to provide us with any public and agency comments that have been received to date. Meredith?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Hello, everybody. Good evening. So yes, we're here today to talk about this application for a multi-residential development on Nelson Street West. As always, but for those of us who are new here today, the purpose of the meeting is threefold. Firstly, to hear a presentation from planning staff with some of the details about the subject lands and the planning application. Secondly, to provide an opportunity for the applicant to speak on behalf of the proposal. And finally, to provide a forum for the public to comment on the proposal. So In this proposal, the applicant is seeking to build multi-residential housing on the property. And the proposed rezoning is seeking to rezone the lands from development exception, so it's D-290, to the residential multiple zone with some site-specific regulations. So the site-specific regulations are as follows. Firstly, to allow for a maximum of 10 residential units and a minimum of 5 units. Secondly, to allow for a mixture of single detached and attached units. And finally, to allow for an interior side yard of 1.2 meters on the west side of the property. So as for where the lands are located, the lot is vacant at the moment. I'll just take the moment to clarify. In the notice that went out, this property was referenced as 396 West Nelson. In fact, this property isn't addressed. What happened was previously this lot and the lot that's adjacent to the west were one, and the lot to the west was severed. The one to the west has a house on it, and so the address went with that property to the west. But there was sort of a discrepancy in the databases that we use, so I labeled this property as the subject property is 396 Nelson, when in fact 396 Nelson is the address that belongs to the property to the west. So when we're referring to this property, we've been referring to it instead as the vacant lot on Nelson Street East. But the legal description can also be used to reference it. So that legal description is that it's the town of Meaford Plan 309, part of lots 1659 and 1660, and part 2 of reference plan 16R-11680. The lands surrounding the lot are all residential. To the west of the property is northwest is the golf course, and the lands are within the urban area of Meaford. The property itself is 3,000 meters approximately, or 0.3 hectares in size. And it's, as I said, it's vacant at the moment, treed, close to Nelson Street. Otherwise, there's grass on the property. And the lands do front Nelson Street West. And in terms of servicing, there is municipal water on Nelson Street, which this property would connect to, this development would connect to. The official plan designation of the lot is urban living area. And in urban living area, there are a variety of housing types that are permitted, including single detached, semi-detached, townhouses, multiple units, and apartments. One of the permitted uses, single detached dwellings are not a permitted use in residential multiple, which is part of the reason that one of the proposed changes to the zoning is to allow for single detached dwellings, because that's part of the proposal. So in urban living area lands, to do a rezoning for townhouse, multiple, and apartment dwellings, a rezoning of that nature would be subject to section B1.1.5 of the OP. So this development will have to respect the character of the existing neighborhood. We'll need to be able to integrate into the surrounding area. It will need to not cause any traffic hazards, and also will need to provide parking. And finally, it will need to be serviced by municipal water and sewer. So the current zoning on the lands, as you can see, the lands and the map are in yellow, and they are D-290, development exception. So the purpose of all lands that are designated as D for development is to limit development in locations where there are not full municipal services yet available for those lands. So in this case, there is water service on Nelson, but there is no wastewater on Nelson at the moment connecting to this property. And also to note, right now, the D-290 exception prohibits any buildings and structures. So anyone who wishes to put any buildings or structures on these lands will need to go through rezoning. So the zoning that's been proposed is to rezone from the D zone to the RM, or residential multiple zone. And the idea is to delete and replace the text of the current 290 exception in order to provide for the specific zoning requests that I identified at the beginning. So the new zone would be RM-290. So we would just keep that exception number, but change the content of the exception. Right now, buildings and structures are prohibited. Instead, we replace it with the site-specific provisions that the applicant has requested. So I thought we would give a little bit more information about the servicing and access on the lot. So as the proposal stands right now, it includes one shared driveway for the units from Nelson Street. So that single driveway would be used to access all of the units on the lot. As I mentioned, there's municipal water available on Nelson Street and Nelson Street West, and the proposal requests to access the sewer service through the rear of the property at Ironwood Drive. And that connection would also service all of the units in the proposal. So just to remind ourselves, and for anyone new joining us, there's several stages to the application. We've already received and reviewed the application in an initial review and deemed it complete. Today we're doing the public meeting. After this point, staff will complete our review and make our recommendations to council in the form of a staff report. Council will then make their decision to pass or not pass the zoning bylaw amendment, after which there will be the mandatory appeal period. If there are no appeals, then the decision is final. To stay engaged and involved in the process, you can there's many ways. Firstly, you can sign up to receive updates on the proposal on Meaford's website. The link is there, and we'd be happy to provide it to anyone who'd like the link. You can also submit comments on the proposal over email at planning@meaford.ca. That's the email address. Or you can make a request in writing to planning@meaford.ca to be notified of the decision. That's the end of the presentation. And I will take a moment just to go through the comments received on the application. So in terms of comments from the Historic Saugeen Métis Lands, Waters and Consultation Department, they had no objection or opposition to the proposed zoning bylaw amendment as presented. The comments from Grey Sauble Conservation Authority noted that there are no hazard lands or regulation areas on the subject property, and so GSCA staff have no concerns and find the proposed application acceptable. Finally, we have some more detailed comments from Grey County Planning Department, so I'll summarize those now. So county staff note that the proposal does include the potential to convert the development into a condominium in the future. And they also note that this proposal is not subject to site plan control because the proposal is for 10 or fewer residential units. That means that site plan control is not triggered. And because of this, there's a few further recommendations from Grey County. Without site plan control, there is more limited availability for municipal planning staff to control the development. So there's some recommendations at this stage, at the zoning stage, that the county have for us. So yeah, Grey County Planning noted that we should ensure that there is a high level of feasibility for the proposal more broadly prior to zoning approval. And also they recommended that additional work be done in order to ensure that the connection to municipal servicing via Ironwood Drive is feasible and available. So that would be for the wastewater or sanitary connection. They also recommended a stormwater management study be undertaken to support the proposed development. And they also recommended a holding provision be applied in any zoning approval to make sure that the stormwater management study that they recommend is prepared to the satisfaction of the municipality. The other comments note that the minimum 20 units per net hectare that's required density for Meaford's urban area in our official plan has been met by this proposal. And yeah, Grey County planning staff also recommend a trail linkage between Ironwood Drive and Nelson in order to support active transportation and connected communities, which is part of Grey County official plan and Meaford official plan. Grey County planning staff also note that the current proposal does not appear to allow for parking on site, visitor parking on site, right? They also note that the driveway width and design may not allow for the maneuvering of vehicles. And finally, they had comments for us regarding tree removal. The county encourages the preservation of trees and notes that the county forest management bylaw and requirements for only removing trees outside bird nesting season. So I gather those comments were from in consultation with county ecologists, and they just recommended that trees are only removed outside of the bird nesting season. So I think I'll leave it there and then answer questions as they may arise. And I understand we also have a presentation from the consultant who's working with the property owner in the file.
Thank you, Meredith. Yes, I understand Caroline Baker, the planning consultant on behalf of the applicant, is here via Zoom, also with a presentation. Caroline, are you on the line?
I am. Good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of council. Can you hear me all right?
We can. Would you mind just introducing yourself by stating your name for the record?
Of course. My name is Caroline Baker from Baker Planning Group, and I'm here this evening representing the owner, Timothy Exner.
Go right ahead.
Perfect. Thank you. Appreciate your time this evening and for the very thorough presentation outlining the application before you. I did also want to note that available on Zoom this evening is also the project engineer, John Proctor from Crozier, just in case there's any detailed servicing questions. If you don't mind moving to the next slide. Certainly, this is an air photo of the site. I believe you've received some information about site size and location. You can see the dual frontages of this property on both Nelson Street and Ironwood Drive, which certainly becomes more relevant as we move forward into the proposed development. Next slide. So I wanted to take time during this presentation to discuss the proposed development in further detail. Certainly, the owner was very intentional in its site design to first, of course, address the surrounding neighborhood to ensure land use compatibility, but also to ensure that matters from the provincial policy statement and the official plan are carried through with this development for efficient and effective development, but also the opportunity to provide a greater range of housing to the community. The proposal is an infilling development on an existing lot that at this time would be geared to older adults with single-story living in a form of a condominium that would allow for lower maintenance, whether it's lawn care or snow removal. The concept you'll see in a moment illustrates 6 bungalow townhouse units, so that's 6 attached units and 2 single detached units. The site is able to accommodate up to 10 units. The concept before you does certainly have 8 units. There is an internal private condominium roadway connecting to Nelson Street, intentional to minimize the number of driveway cuts and access points to Nelson. There is on-site parking with 2 parking spaces per unit, which I would note exceeds the parking requirements in the zoning bylaw. The design has allowed for a private rear yard amenity area and certainly area for snow storage in the winter months. Next slide, please. On the screen now is the conceptual site plan that was designed for the site. And maybe I'll just mention further to the comments from Grey County. We're certainly well aware of the provincial changes from Bill 23 related to site plan not being required for 10 or less units. And in this regard, the owner proceeded to prepare a conceptual site plan. So site plan drawing like you would see for a site plan application to demonstrate that the proposed units are feasible for the site and can meet the requirements of the zoning bylaw. For example, the driveway access meets zoning requirements. There is a hammerhead for cars to suitably turn around. But what I also want to point out on this concept is you'll see at this time there are 2 single detached dwellings fronting Nelson Street, proposed at a setback in keeping with the neighborhood. And then there is the proposed 6 one-story bungalow townhouses to the rear, which do include a 7.5-meter rear yard setback, which is the standard required setback for low-density residential uses. Next slide, please. The owner has pulled some sample images to suggest design intent of this smaller development, again, looking for a lower form of housing in terms of 1 story, but also meeting some overall density objectives. What you'll see in some of these sample images is there is, of course, a garage with a parking space out front, some communal and green spaces for the owners to enjoy. And the units would come out to be approximately about 1,000 square foot each. Next slide, please. As mentioned, what is before you this evening is a zone change application. Certainly a zone change is required for any development on the site. In this instance, a site-specific RM zone is being requested. You'll see that the addition of single detached dwellings is being requested, as well as setting minimum and maximum number of dwelling units on the property. Next slide. As noted was earlier, the site is designated as a primary settlement area. Certainly, infilling and intensification is encouraged at the provincial, county, and local level. The Meaford official plan, with its recent updates, requires a minimum density of 25 units per hectare. And evaluation criteria for this form of development, being townhouses, was certainly included in our submission and planning justification report. Next slide. In conclusion, as part of our submission, it was our opinion that the application conforms to both the county and local official plan, meeting the targets at 25.9 units per hectare. Certainly, this is a needed housing type in the community, catering to older adults who are looking for a particular type of housing. And with the smaller unit sizes and infilling, we have a greater opportunity to provide attainable housing. Servicing is available for the development. As noted, there's water on Nelson Street and there's sanitary to the rear on Ironwood. The owner has retained Crozier. There has been a functional servicing report prepared. Capacity in these systems has been assessed, and dialogue, of course, continues with municipal staff in that regard. As noted, the site design addresses land use compatibility with setbacks and buffers in keeping with the low residential density in the immediate area. Next slide. With respect to the zoning bylaw amendment application, the site-specific provisions were very intentional to implement county and local policy. The minimum number of units proposed is to ensure that we can meet that density in those documents and that there's a minimum certainty of units with that development. Similarly, there's also a maximum number of dwelling units proposed, again, to address land use compatibility of what is suitable and feasible to sensitively integrate onto this site. Next slide. This is the last slide, just providing a summary of those intentional design approaches that have been applied to this development. If we start at the bottom of the page or bottom of your screen, you'll see there's a 7.5 meter front yard with single dwellings facing Nelson Street. You'll see a single access to Nelson. There is a minimum of 2 parking spaces per unit, as well as you'll see spacing for servicing connections and no access to Ironwood, which is some feedback and input we've received from residents through previous public consultation with respect to this site. I did just also want to respond to the comments from Grey County, which we were in receipt of this afternoon. Certainly look forward to working with Grey County planning staff on those comments. Just a few notes, as I mentioned, a conceptual site plan has been prepared in light of the Bill 23 changes, and that a site plan application is no longer required. Again, analysis has been completed to ensure sufficient servicing, both water and sanitary. At the building permit stage, it would be suitable to request stormwater management. Typically, a building permit, lot grading and drainage plans are a requirement of not only Meaford, but all surrounding municipalities, and certainly stormwater management will be important to review and assess during that process. We will work with staff. However, there would be some hesitation to put a holding provision on for these matters, because they can be addressed through other required legal processes, and in fact, don't meet the spirit and intent of Bill 23 of not requiring site plan for 10 or less units. So certainly that's the end of my presentation, but I am here to answer any questions of council, or should there be any members in attendance online or in person. Thank you.
Are there any questions from council for Caroline? Councillor Greenfield.
Thanks, Your Worship. Thanks for the presentation. I may have a couple of questions, but I'll start with this one. Along Nelson Street, the overhead image that we have in front of us shows a number of fairly mature looking trees along Nelson Street. Now, this time of year, it's pretty hard to tell whether just how healthy they are. But I'm hoping, I realize there has to be room allowed for the driveway into the housing, but I'm just wondering if as many of those trees, if indeed they are in a good state of health, can they be left? Is that a part of the plan, or have you discussed that as of yet?
Through the mayor to Councillor Greenfield, certainly thank you for your question, and you are correct. There are trees along the frontage on Nelson Street West. They are a mixture of coniferous trees and what I would call sort of shrub trees. I believe, and I can certainly work with the owner to look at options to retain some of those trees, with the front yard setback being 7.5 meters and limiting the development to only one driveway access from Nelson Street. There's actually a greater opportunity for tree preservation than, say, if there was multiple lots with multiple driveways fronting Nelson Street. So certainly something I'll continue to work with the owner on.
Thank you.
Deputy Mayor Keaveney.
Thank you very much, Your Worship. Good afternoon, everyone. It was mentioned in relation to parking that there was no visitor parking on site. So I'm just wondering if there's a solution for that. I just don't want to see residents in the community subjected to visitors parking out on Nelson Street.
Through the mayor. So thank you for that question. Certainly it came up with the Grey County planning staff's comments, and they had concerns that there wasn't separate visitor parking. The intent with the design is that each unit will actually exceed the parking requirement in the zoning bylaw, providing for the equivalent of 0.5 parking spaces per unit for visitors. There is greater parking on the singles. So one of the singles on the lot has the option for up to 4 parking spaces. What we typically see in zoning bylaws in small to medium-sized municipalities across Southern Ontario for developments like this that, let's say, have bungalow townhouses, is a visitor parking rate of 0.25 per dwelling unit, fairly standard across the board. And in this case, each unit has at least 0.5 parking spaces per unit extra than what the zoning bylaw currently requires.
Councillor Urick.
Well, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yeah, thank you for the presentation, and I will kind of piggyback on Deputy Mayor's comments. The reason I bring it up is, well, being an older gentleman who does live in the kind of thing you're trying to build, quite enjoyable, and we do need it. But I will say, as a gentleman who's been on many condo boards, and the 1.5, while it meets municipal standards, I can tell you does create problems because you have two guests and the person who lives there has one car and they have two guests. That visitor parking becomes a problem. So that's my only concern. I think in theory, I like the density is necessary, but if there was any way to get visitor parking in there, that even at 1.5, that becomes an issue. Thank you.
Councillor Bell.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I've pulled up in front of myself the aerial photograph, and it shows the lot that we're talking about outlined in yellow. And I'm looking at the edge where it shows a residence from Nelson Street on the left-hand side. Is there an encroachment on the property between the one that's proposed and an existing dwelling that will need to be dealt with?
Through the mayor, that there's often a bit of a skew. Great question in terms of an air photo. The way the shadows and air photos are often taken, it can appear that a dwelling is either on the property line or over, when in fact it's not. Through the previous consent application, this property was surveyed by an Ontario land surveyor, as well as the existing dwelling. So those additional survey points and boundaries give greater confidence that we don't have an encroachment issue.
Are there any other questions, Deputy Mayor?
Thank you, Your Worship, for allowing a second question. I just wondered if I could ask staff, and overall, this project brings housing to Meaford that we know is certainly marketable. And so because it's been mentioned that, site plan's not required, I just wondered if you could speak to the process of how this then moves forward from here in terms of approvals and what happens next.
I can take that one. So typically we would, in some smaller development proposals like this weren't subject to site plan control previously through our site plan control bylaw, which does pose challenges. Sometimes it's easier when we have that process, even for the applicant, despite what Bill 23 is trying to do, just because it creates a clearer process forward. So in this case, what we would do is we're going to continue to do the review, including the preliminary servicing information we were provided previously. So a preliminary servicing report was given to us in the summer and some other details through pre-consultation as well. And we'll continue to review those along with the information we get from today and our normal staff review and through our internal departments, and then bring back a staff report for council to review. We can still, I know the applicant's planner, Caroline, mentioned that they're hoping not to have a holding symbol, but that isn't a potential option that we could do if we needed more time to be able to satisfy some servicing issues, to make sure that we can get the appropriate agreement in place before the zoning is approved. So if, for example, if the report came back in a couple of weeks or a few weeks saying that, yes, it looks like it could be approved, if we could recommend approval for it. There is no typical mechanism with no site plan approval to force anybody to enter into an agreement with the municipality. So that's the potential of having either site plan control or a holding symbol. But we're happy to talk with the applicant about alternatives if they can come up with any other ideas of how to do something like that. And then the next step would be council to make a decision. If there's any other outstanding steps that we need to resolve, that we would hope to get those within an agreement with the property owner. There were previous discussions on this proposal in different forms last year through pre-consultation, and one of them was that yes, when servicing comes down Nelson Street in the future, which was certainly something that is in our master plan for servicing, that's the sewer would come down Nelson Street to pass the property, that they would connect to that in the future and disconnect from Ironwood to allow them to pay into that servicing program. Those sorts of things would be part of that agreement. And then at that point, hopefully we would have a draft at that point by the time we come back with the recommendation, if we are recommending approval. Meaning a draft, it wouldn't go to council necessarily. I'm not really sure where that agreement goes, given that we don't have site plan approval. So that's something I may have to speak with our interim CAO/clerk about how to implement that, because through site plan approval, that was already delegated to staff. This is an example of how much easier it would have been maybe just to have site plan, because we could have just went through, charged straight through to that process. So we can talk a little bit more with the applicant and their planner and their other experts about the servicing potential on Ironwood and how we can get that resolved in an agreement form, and any other things we have to do. If that makes sense, it's the same as all zoning amendments. It's just making sure that before council makes a decision, we've at least come to terms with the principles of development, kind of like what the county's saying. And I think that's what the applicant's proposing as well, which is why they've given us so many details ahead of time.
Just remind council that there is a representative from Crozier and Associates if you had any technical questions you wanted to ask. Councillor Greenfield?
Just have another question for Ms. McCarl, if I can. I think I know the answer to this. Because this is a relatively small development, there's no parkland designation aspect to it.
Through the mayor to the councilor's question, it's a really good question. Actually, parkland dedication is typically taken through subdivision or through site plan control. So those are the two mechanisms I'm aware of that we would take parkland dedication.
All right. I understand as well as that the applicant, Tim Exner, is available via Zoom. Tim, are you on the line? Hello, Tim.
Yes, sir, I am. Good evening.
Okay. If you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself by stating your name for the record.
Sure. My name is Tim Exner.
Tim, did you wish to say anything about, your plan here?
I don't really think I have anything to add, except that I do appreciate the time and attention everybody's taken on this, staff in particular, to date. And I think Caroline has done an excellent job of explaining the background here and the intent. So I'm just grateful for the attention on it, and I'm looking forward to working through the process.
Does anyone have a question for Tim? Councillor Bartley?
Thank you, Mayor Kentner. Actually, it's to Ms. McCarl. Why would D290 be put on this in the first place?
To you, Mr. Mayor, to the councilor's question. So I'm going to try to go back in time and imagine why they wanted to put D290. So the property was zone D originally, and typically that doesn't allow you to sever at all, because the way that the zoning is structured, it's basically like a holding type of zone. It's a zone that's put on properties that are of a larger size in an area where they could be severed or developed in some way. They're not at their full potential, but there is some matters that are outstanding, such as full services to that property. So you'll notice that in the Union Center area, there's a number of D properties because they don't all have full sewer over there. Sometimes they have other factors that make it not available for them to develop now. And that basically helps to limit their potential today of what they can do. Like they come in, sever tomorrow and create another lot, just so that we can ensure that when the services are brought to those properties, that they're developed at their highest and best, so we can get more density to them. So if we just let people sever these lots on partial services, then they're going to have to be pretty big, and they won't be efficiently used. So in this case, the previous decision of the Committee of Adjustment and the zoning that was applied was recognizing that the house was on the side of the property, so it was on the western side, and that they could support the idea of severing off what we would call the surplus vacant area, which meant that it could be held on and then in the future serviced or future developed. And that was why it was done. So the D90 was a site-specific exception to basically just hold it, like not allow another house to be built, because that doesn't meet the spirit of what the D was, but just hold on to the future. So I believe that the current property owner did sever this off previously and had a plan for something to do with it, and then's now brought that forward. So he wasn't able to use this vacant parcel until it's rezoned. So basically, we put it into a zone that doesn't allow anything, just a vacant piece of land, or as a condition of previously severing off that house. Does that make sense?
Kinda, I just don't know why we'd put a D on something that we're gonna allow to go forward as a residential eventually.
So through you, Mr. Mayor, the only way it could be supported was that to sever off the house, and was to limit the potential at that time until something came forward with an actual concrete plan. So at the time, I don't think the owner had a concrete plan of what they were going to do with it. I mean, probably Mr. Exner can speak more specifically. I read through the file pretty extensively myself, but it was just a few years ago. But that would be the only way it was supportable. So normally we don't let people in D properties. So if you might remember, there was a zoning amendment last year where the person had a D property and severed. It's because services had finally been brought down to the property through, I'll say Gates of Kent, I guess. That was the zoning amendment and severance on the Lamb property. And in that case, it was rezoned to a residential category as part of that, and that recognized that now has services, and the severance was permitted. So the D was there until a concrete plan to do something came forward that would meet our policies.
We also have one other pre-registration via Zoom, Robert Bullock. Robert, are you on the line?
Yes, I am.
Would you just introduce yourself by stating your name for the record? Thank you.
Robert Bullock. We reside at 114 Ironwood, the extreme south end of Ironwood Drive. My question concerns sewer access, which the owners of Ironwood understand are going to be access to the existing sewer line on Ironwood. A few of us have concerns with respect to two 60-foot maples that are on the extreme south end of Ironwood. And we're hoping that Meaford Works, when accessing the sewer, can avoid the root structure of these 60-foot maples. I'm wondering, I doubt the council would have an answer to this at this point in time, but I'd like to register it as a concern by the owners of Ironwood Drive.
Thank you very much. Did anyone wish to respond? I don't think we have anybody from operations or the facility side to talk about that, but thank you for your question, sir. There have been other pre-registrations to speak in person at this meeting by members of the public. Is there anyone who wishes to speak who did not pre-register? If so, you're welcome to come to the microphone here, and Margaret will turn it on for you. If you'll just please state your name for the record when you get to the podium.
Good afternoon, and I appreciate your giving me a chance to talk. My name is Ed Thornton, and I live at 383 Nelson Street. Just a couple of questions. I know maybe I didn't hear right, but you said there's going to be a driveway coming into the off of Nelson Street. What's the difference between a driveway and a street as far as dimension?
I'm gonna turn that over to Meredith.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Mayor. So the driveway versus the street, they're two different terms, like as they're defined in our zoning bylaw. So I think what might be best is I can kind of give the definitions. So for a driveway, that is referred to as the portion of the lot used to provide vehicular access from public street, private street, or lane to an off-street parking or loading area, or private garage or carport located on the same lot. In cases where there is no parking area, loading area, private garage, or carport, the driveway is deemed to be the portion of the lot that is designed and arranged to provide vehicular access to the lot and used for the parking of motor vehicles. Versus the road. Let's go to there. Second. So the public street is the roadway owned by the public authority, which affords a principal means of access to abutting lots, and for the purposes of this bylaw does not include a lane or any private street. So regarding the size of the driveway used to access the units, I think the proponent can speak to that further. It does depend on the proponent's plans for the site. And there aren't going to be any changes to Nelson Street as part of this proposal. So I defer to the proponent if she wishes to speak to that.
Okay, thank you. Are you there, Caroline?
Yes, certainly, through the mayor, to the question. So certainly the concept plan that's been submitted, the private driveway proposed is 6 meters wide, and it would be a two-way private road that would just service this development. If it were a municipal road, my understanding, subject to confirmation from Public Works and Engineering, is a municipal road typically has a overall municipal ownership of 20 meters wide. That doesn't mean the road is 20 meters wide, but usually it's 20 meters wide to accommodate a boulevard, sidewalk, curbs, and the two-lane traffic. So certainly a private road or condominium road is smaller and is used in condominium developments where it's a private road and there's not a lot of traffic or through access. Thank you.
Okay, so basically it's going to be half the width of a street or a road. So that means if there's any parking there, and I just get a little bit confused there where it says that there's how many parking spots are there per lot? And does that too include the garage? So it's one in the garage, one car in the garage, one on the laneway?
Through the mayor, yes, that's correct.
Okay, so if they have visitation parties, whatever goes on, that means that they could be parked out on Nelson Street. Or what I can see happening is the people that on Ironwood, where that cul-de-sac is, they can park there, and I assume that there's going to be a walkway there because there is now. So they can now that ties up the cul-de-sac on Ironwood. Would that be a fair statement?
Through you, Mr. Mayor. So as the proponent mentioned, the proposal actually exceeds the required parking, like the required parking for the proposal for the lot of this size and for what's proposed. So staff have no concerns about parking at this time. May I want to add a little bit to that?
So I just wanted to address, there's no trail or walkway proposed at this point. I know we had comments from the county suggesting a walkway, but there isn't a proposed walkway from Ironwood Drive at this point. So I think there is the opportunity for folks. I'm guessing that most people would choose to park if they visited and they didn't want to enter the site. They could still park out front on Nelson Street, just like everybody else can do on every other single detached house. There's actually quite a good length of frontage, which will allow a couple of extra cars there as well. If this lot were developed as a row of townhouses, there'd be no street parking in front of those units, and they would have to park down the street. As you know, and anybody who's is on a townhouse, even on a public road, you park further down. So street parking during the day is during the wintertime is fine, and overnight is still fine for visitors on any public street that allows for street parking. I don't think we want people to be relying on street parking for their regular parking, but certainly for visitors, it's acceptable. I wouldn't necessarily, I'm not saying that no one would ever park on Ironwood Drive because I don't have a crystal ball, but I would suggest that likely they're going to park on Nelson Street out front of the property because that's the address that they would have. So if your friends are coming to visit you and they use Google to enter their, their information in, I don't know why I'm typing it, but enter it into Google on their phone or tell it on their car or something like that, they're likely to go to the frontage on Nelson Street, which I think has enough parking for a few cars out on the street as well, for visitors, which is what they do at most people's houses. So if that helps answer the question.
Okay, now I might have missed this. Are they going to be rentals or are they going to be privately owned, each unit?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, the intention from the proponent right now and the owner is to rent the properties. To rent the properties, yes.
Or it could be.
Yeah, or it could be a condo, in which case they would be sold.
Okay, thank you very much.
Is there anyone else wishes to speak to the this time? Go ahead, but if you'll just identify yourself.
Yes, good evening, Your Worship. My name is John Hobson, Hobson, and I live at 48 Ironwood Drive. I have two concerns. First of all, it was mentioned that the planning engineering staff have looked at the sewer capacity, but they have not stated what the outcome has been. Is there sufficient capacity for this complex to be put into the sewer on Ironwood? Or is it less than the capacity or more than the capacity of these sewers that could be handled?
Go ahead, Ms. McCall.
So just to help the meeting move along more smoothly, I'm going to suggest that if Caroline and her team could write down the questions and maybe address them all as a group at the end. So if folks are okay posing questions, if they're ones we can't answer because they need us to come back with more information, or go look up some information as you've mentioned, Mr. Mayor, in your script at the beginning, we can reach out to folks separately and get answers to any questions that we couldn't answer tonight if they require more information on us looking something up. We haven't municipally finished our review, so we haven't guaranteed capacity or no capacity at this point. I understand, as you've noted, that the engineer for the applicant is here, so maybe they want to reserve answering any further questions to the end. So at the very end of the public comments and questions, we can double back around to the applicant's team to wrap up with any follow-up questions that they have or answers that any of the questions that were posed. And that will help us maybe rather than a back and forth, if that works.
And could I ask a question at this point myself? I'm wondering if there's any precedent in the municipality of Meaford for a driveway versus a road. And I'm thinking of places like where the deputy mayor and Councillor Urig live, and Gates of Kent and some of those places. Could you comment on that?
Absolutely, Mr. Mayor. So if a rental were to be built, just think of it as an apartment building. So this is like a deconstructed apartment building with 8 to 10 units, maximum of 10 proposed at this point. And if you think about it being a 10-plex or an 8-plex, we would just have a driveway in and a parking area. And that's basically what this is proposing. It's just they're separate buildings. And the only way that would work is if either they're in a common ownership, something like a rental, so one owner owns it and rents out those units, or if it becomes a standard condominium where everyone owns the lands that aren't their actual unit. So they all own the driveway, they all own the open space, if that makes sense. You can also have you could have exclusive use areas where your little yard is your yard or your parking space is your parking space, but that would be the two scenarios that we would typically see. And that's no different than any of the apartment buildings we see, or as you've noted, some of those other developments around like Gates of Kent, which operate very similarly to something much like an apartment building does, where everyone, all the residents can come in and use their parking spaces. And if there's visitor parking, they can use those just like they would in an apartment building with assigned parking. But visitors can also come in or drop off, deliveries or anything like that. And that operates more like a driveway. So we call those a private drive versus a road or a private road. To me, a private road looks like a road, not a driveway like this would. And it tends to be a little bit wider. So what you think of as a condominium road through a subdivision, that's a little bit tighter than a typical municipal road.
Thank you very much. Did you have anything else to
Yes,
question?
Your Worship, I have a second question. At the last meeting on this subject, there was a reference to a 1 foot buffer zone on the north end of the property. And this buffer zone apparently was, as I understood it, a zone that was not to be crossed by municipal services or by municipal services. I have not heard one word about this buffer zone. And I will, tonight, I do not see it on the information that's being supplied to this meeting. And I was wondering if it was originally placed on the property before the development had started. Why is it not there now?
So hopefully Ms. Baker, when she comes back online, will answer your questions.
Thank you, Your Worship.
Thank you. I think I'm going to come back to council just for a second if you have any. So Deputy Mayor, go ahead.
Thank you, Your Worship. I appreciate the opportunity. I just wondered if I could ask either Caroline or Denise, on the roadway, looking at the square end of it, does that allow for emergency vehicle turnaround?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, to the Deputy Mayor's question. So I'm just going to jump in here just because right now we are seeing sort of that conceptual site plan, but we haven't done any review of there's no engineering review, and that's because there is no site plan review. So it would be subject to building code requirements for fire lane, that type of thing. And that's really kind of where we are at this point. So we haven't had an engineer review this to date. We are going to have some preliminary engineering comments on that high level to make sure that it can be developed. But generally speaking, if they're coming in at that 10 or fewer units, we won't be having a full engineering review because of that whole bill 23 implications not having site plan control. But we will have some preliminary stuff for council by the time we bring a recommendation report back, just to make sure that from a concept, we can fit all those units in and that the servicing can be completed. In terms of turning lanes or turning around and all of that, I don't know that we'll have that at that point, but we'll do our best to get as much as we can. Given that we don't have site plan, that stuff would just generally be kept through done through building code review.
Thank you, Ms. McCarl. I think just before we go back to the proponents, Representative Meredith, are there any points that have been raised that you wish to respond to at this point?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, no. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ms. McCarroll?
I'm jumping in. I was just going to speak to the 1 foot reserve that was mentioned. I can answer that actually. So the 1 foot reserve is put on basically every single subdivision that abuts any other lands to stop anybody from just automatically going on to that new subdivision. And that doesn't mean that in the future they couldn't. But what it means is when Ironwood subdivision was being developed, someone doesn't have an adjacent property and decide they're going to try to put a driveway in and go onto Ironwood Drive. That's an example in this case. And that's because partly we may want to control when you can access a property when a new subdivision is going in, but there may be cases where we never want someone to lift. We never want to lift that 1 foot reserve because it's just not ideal. In this particular case, that 1 foot reserve is there to just kind of limit access till a certain period of time, or if access cannot be provided because there isn't sufficient frontage, et cetera. There was a different lot down the road on Ironwood Drive that was severed previously a couple of years ago. So folks who were on council at that time may remember it. It's closer to the entrance to Ironwood Drive, and a 1 foot reserve had to be removed on that property to allow a driveway. That's still the case on this property. So the 1 foot reserve is still in place. And so prior to anybody getting an entrance, which they're not proposing, or any other things where we need to lift that 1 foot reserve, council would have to make a decision on that. We haven't got to that level of detail yet because they're not actually asking to enter through that, but putting a service through there is a different matter, and certainly does still need permission of the municipality to do. But just to be clear, it's not a buffer per se, but it means that little 1 foot piece is not actually road in front of, from between Ironwood Drive and this Nelson Street property. So they don't have automatic rights to just enter the property through Ironwood Drive is really what we're talking about at this point. So it's not something that we're reviewing as part of the zoning, and we're not talking about lifting it as part of the zoning, but we are aware that it's there, and it's something that we've talked about with the applicant previously in our discussions.
Thank you. So now I'm going to ask the applicant to share their closing remarks, either Tim or Caroline. Please go ahead.
Thank you for the opportunity. Just one quick note for one question from Mr. Hobson. I believe he was asking about the sanitary capacity on Ironwood. From what I understand, that is a existing 200 millimeter or 8-inch pipe that could typically have a capacity to service about 150 residential units. And I believe there is certainly less than that currently on Ironwood being serviced by that. So we look forward to working with staff through their review in terms of capacity within that system. I believe the question regarding the 1 foot reserve would certainly agree on its intent, and was going to provide a similar response to that, but I think it's been well covered. We'll certainly appreciate all the input of council and members of the public this evening, and we'll certainly take those back and review with staff, and look forward to being in front of you in a near date to consider a recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. And I want to thank everyone for attending this meeting and sharing your thoughts on this application. This matter will now be referred back to Development Services staff, and they will follow up on any additional information required from the applicant based on matters raised today. Once staff are satisfied that they have all necessary information needed to provide a recommendation on the applications, a detailed planning report will be brought back to council to assist us in our decision-making. This report will evaluate how the proposal either does or does not satisfy the provincial, county, and municipal policies that must be considered as part of council's decision. It will also explore the various public and agency comments received regarding the application, noting those tools which may be applied in order to address concerns raised and to mitigate potential impacts on nearby properties. If you would like to receive mailed notice of a future decision on this file, please provide your contact information to the Planning Services Division by email at planning@meaford.ca. And with that, I'm going to declare this meeting adjourned.